Today's guest on a Life and a Living podcast is Esther Weinberg. Now, Esther is the founder of an organization called The Ready Zone, and she's also the author of the book, which is called Why Your Company's Bottom Line is Not Your Top Priority. And we talk a little bit about that in the book because she has a real view on that. But we talk about, how in the current climate, how you have a motivated environment when everybody is working virtually, how you do that, how you achieve it, and how you sustain it. But we also talk about, a couple of she has 6 zone performance indicators, and we talk about a couple of them. One is being pivot ready. We all talk about pivoting, but how do you actually ensure that your organization is pivot ready? We also talk about being action ready and being impact ready. And also we're very, very interesting conversation about the impact for employees and for employers as we move back towards a combination of being in office and virtual, and what that means for the employees in terms of the opportunity, because it's now truly a global workforce, and also for the employers and the challenges that it brings. And I think it was a really interesting conversation, and Esther had some really good takes on that I'd encourage you to listen to. If you want to listen to other podcasts, I would really appreciate if you go to the website, www.johnmurphyinternational.com. We also would love if you would give us a review on iTunes, because that helps us to get it out to a wider audience. But in the meantime, sit back and enjoy the conversation with Esther Weinberg. Esther, thank you so much indeed for joining us here in a Life and a Living podcast. It's a great honor to have you with us.
Oh, John, it's an absolute delight. We've been chatting it up for quite a bit. We could probably talk for 5 hours.
Nearly forgot to start recording the podcast after all that.
That's true.
So you're the founder of the Ready Zone, and you've also published a book. I think you published it quite recently, Why Your Company's Bottom Line is Not Your Top Priority. So tell me why it isn't, because that is heresy to so many people.
Well, you forgot the tagline, 6 eye-opening strategies to put people first. Well, I'll tell you what happened. So it was interesting probably over the last year more dramatically. I had a few things happen that I started hearing that I had not heard before from people. So you know that workplace cultures are, we talk about it a lot, obviously, because it's a work in progress. So I remember there was a day I was having a conversation with the head of product for a tech company, and he looked just green. And I remember we were doing a Zoom session, and I said to him, he said, I got to tell you, I was in the hospital last night. I had kidney stones, and I was released, and here I am. And I said, what are you doing in the office? And he said, well, I have a meeting at 6 o'clock. And I said, okay, so, mm-hmm. And he said, well, I have a meeting at 6 o'clock. I have to be at this meeting. So I said, well, what if they kept you in the hospital for 2 days or overnight? Who would you have sent to this meeting in your stead? So he said, oh, my vice president, I would have sent her. So I said, so why are you here? And he was telling me that the pressure at work was just unrelenting, and there was no way that he couldn't be. Then there was another story of a gentleman who told his HR head that he had to take the phone into the bathroom. He said, I wish I could stop taking the phone into the bathroom to answer emails, and he was serious. Or another woman who shared during a retreat that she had to hire a nanny just to get through emails on the weekends, so that they could childcare on the weekends. So as I started adding these up, the one thing, and then you start adding in, other data that PwC released a global survey, CEO survey, that shared that 55% of all CEOs worldwide believe a lack of trust is a major threat to organizations' growth. So if you put all those equations together, you start seeing that there's something fundamentally broken that was broken even before COVID started. Mm-hmm. And so if cultures are unsustainable. How are they going to be more sustainable now that people are working from home?
Yeah.
So that's why we created this methodology called the Ready Zone, and that's why I named the book what we did, because we saw that the one thing, if it was inserted in the equation, would make the difference. If workplace cultures were actually devised based on trust, respect, and safety, but it's most people value that, but they don't measure it. So
Mhm.
that's why we created what we call 6 zone performance indicators. Those are 6, you would call it our KPIs for the Ready Zone, that actually look at and measure, so you can have an indicator to see where are we at on this spectrum for creating that workplace culture that we really want, rather than something that we don't want.
And when if you go back to the document that PwC, where it's talking about trust, were they talking about? Do they elaborate in terms of where that lack of trust emanates from?
It was interesting because they didn't quite go deeply into what it was, but it's interesting because there was an author named Paul Zak who wrote a book called The Trust Factor, The Science of Creating High Performance Companies. And he said, and in an article very articulately in Harvard Business Review, that employees in high trust organizations had 74% less stress. He actually
Mm.
quoted this statistic that I thought was insane, which he said they have 106% more energy and 50% higher productivity, 13% fewer sick days, 76% more engagement. So when you put that stat next to the stat of the CEOs, you would say there's definitely, how do we put out, where is our focus as a business imperative? And how, if we put that I in a different place, would actually make all the difference in not just productivity, but profitability. I mean, look, we're not talking about nonprofits here. We're talking
Yeah,
about
sure.
profitable
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
organizations.
yeah. But I mean, if you look at, if you look at the work that's been done down through the years, and clearly there's a direct correlation between the level of trust and the performance of a business. So even for very good commercial reasons, there is a good reason to develop trust. But also, that kind of trust comes from the very top of the organization.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
and that's where you need to actually develop that. But I want to come on to your 6 zone performance indicators in a second. But if you just go back to what you were saying in
Mm.
terms of the current climate,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is challenging. It's COVID. We're maybe coming out, going back in, whatever way you want to
Yeah.
describe it. But we're sure as hell not over it,
No, no,
despite
we're
what some
not.
people might say. But
That's
I
true.
mean, how in that, one of the challenges, and I see it in the work that I'm doing with clients, is that, and I give you an example of somebody I
Please.
was talking to there very recently, and they were saying that their boss is just phoning them and contacting them all of the time. Now, I
Uh-huh.
also happen to be doing some work with the boss involved, and I was able to have the conversation with him. Is that, and what it actually emanated from, to go back to trust, was
Mm-hmm.
that previously he saw most of his staff kind of sitting outside his office at desks,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now he is not seeing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a consequence, he's all the time contacting. Now his take on it is that,
Mm-hmm.
well, I want to support them, I want to check in with them, and I was trying to make the point of no, but actually how it's being received is you don't trust them, and at the core of it,
Mm-hmm.
that's probably the case. But even allowing for that, and it was
Mm-hmm.
okay, so how do you do that? But allowing for that, where everybody is working virtually, and it can be challenging for some and easier for others. I think anybody working with small children and trying to homeschool,
Oh, yeah.
they should get an
Impossible.
Oscar for
Mm-hmm.
doing it.
Yes,
Yeah,
I would agree.
and but how do you keep that kind of environment at a kind of a highly motivated level?
That is the question, isn't it? So
Yeah.
I would dismantle it in a couple of ways. First of all, I love your example because it illustrates a couple of things. One thing that I have seen in COVID is, so let's talk about 2 areas. One is the area that you're citing, that people are leaning because I'm not physically seeing you. So what's fascinating is that teams were not designed to be led remotely in this large scale way. So most companies, even tech companies, would probably admit that they had percentages of their workforces that were virtual, right? And we could put them in a box, right? But they were on task forces, or they're on projects, or they're part of the team, they're remote. And the other side of it is boundaries. So what you're seeing, what's happening now is a massive crossing over of boundaries, because we have not actually allowed people to put boundaries in place, to say no, to be able to push back. And so what's happening now, I was seeing it across the board before COVID. Now it's just a massive erasing of the lines, is that people are thinking that I work 19 hours a day. And even if you have children, because I can't see you. And so my expectation, just like before in the good old days, which was 5 months ago, I could send an email at midnight and not think anything of it. I had this happen. I remember years ago when I was doing an offsite, and there were 30 people in the room, and they called their leader out because she said, I want you all to have boundaries. And one woman got up, and telling you, so bold, who said, I appreciate that. I'm very grateful. So you send emails at midnight and 2 a.m. Is your expectation that we answer them? Because I feel like it is, and I do. So I have the phone by my bed. Now, there's hundreds of stories like that. But I think in COVID, what's happening is that people don't know how to set boundaries, because they believe that because there's been furloughs and layoffs, that you're going to be part of the ticker. But I would say to people, look, you have to do one thing. You have to do several things. Number one, as it relates to boundaries, then we'll do the other part. But number one, you need to identify where you have boundaries that are working well, where that they're enforced. Because I always find that if you feel like you're successful at something, you're that much more excited to keep doing it. But if you think you're failing at something, you don't really have a lot of energy to keep it going.
Absolutely.
No. So if you look at number one, where do you have boundaries and where are they working? And I would actually literally write this down. Here's where I have boundaries and with whom, and be very precise about it, and here where they're working. Then what I would do is I would identify at least 5 areas, and you can do this in your personal life well as professional, but I would, since we're leaning in on work, I would write down at least 5 areas or 5 people to which your boundaries have been crossed, or where you want boundaries where they don't exist, or where they're weak that you'd like them to be strong, where they're none or they're weak. Then what I would do is actually then write down, what is your ideal? What are the kind of boundaries that you would want to put in place and with whom? And I would number them, what's most important to least important out of your list. And then I would go to work on your number one. But the thing is, you have to remember a few things. We've taught people how to treat us. So if you've been working, I remember a long time ago when I worked for Fox, when I worked for FX Network, and I was working at 9 o'clock at night, and the head of production in New York came over to me and she said, you realize that LA people now know that they can call you at 9 o'clock at night. So, and it was 6 o'clock in the evening for them. So I would say that you have to remember that as you start putting boundaries in place, there will be pushback. So you have to educate people and keep giving it the good go, because it's not going to be an overnight sensation. But you have to know that also most likely the person who has a lack of boundaries and who's pushing on you also has that as well. So they're pushing on you. If you push back to them, it's good mirroring for them about what to do, because we have to start educating each other now. It's not just a one-side deal.
Yeah. So then going back to the motivation, how do you keep the people motivated? How do you create that environment of motivation with virtual, when people are working virtually?
Well, there's a whole different skill set, I think, that people need now that they haven't indexed on before. And you and I were talking about it before, and it can't be understated, which is around the word of, well, we can call it a bunch of fancy things, but it's an old thing, but it's coming back in spades, which is around emotional intelligence and managing emotions. And I think there's been some great work over the last couple of years by Dr. Mark Brackett and Susan David, who's written about emotional agility and who's written about the management of your emotional state. Because I think that a few things that people do not realize, there is an actual cost to where people are at, because there's a few things that's happened. Not only are people have a heightened emotional state now, people also have trauma and are emerging from trauma. And we have not been trained and taught as leaders how to actually manage that. So if you have people in your life who have passed from COVID, who have had COVID, don't you think that they're going to be a hyper emotional, a hyper traumatic state when they come back to work? I have a friend of mine who's in the healthcare system in the UK, and they were talking about bringing people back to work. And she was saying to her CEO, we have to start managing a workforce that has been traumatized. And I said, what are you talking about? We just need to get people back to work. And she said, we're missing, because what happens is, what we mistake is when people are actually in this heightened emotional state, from a neuroscience perspective, they actually cannot have the attentional capacity. They're compromised in their mental health. They're compromised in productivity. They're compromised in creativity. So what leaders need to start doing is they need to lean in on how your team is actually, the health of your team, how people are actually doing, and understanding that people are at different phases and spaces, because someone could be more stressed than someone else. Someone could be managing in a more emotional state. Someone can be managing their children or a sick parent. So, and because people are they're at home and they're in a box, right? Because if you're in an apartment, you live alone, so there's so many factors. So I think what leaders need to start leaning into, need to start over-indexing on empathy. How do I actually help people compartmentalize things? Yeah. How do I actually allow space for people to share honestly where they're at, and me as a leader to take that into account while setting deadlines, while setting expectations? And what I find too, I had this conversation with a client of mine at Netflix the other day, is that she said, I find that everyone has, like my boss, decided one day to set this Google Excel document with our goals. Like, what are our career goals now? She's like, no one can focus on that. My team can't focus in on that now. And I said to her, why don't you reset your expectations with her? And why don't you reset your expectations with your team for the next 90 days? What are you expecting from them? What is the go, no go? And I think that we need to start thinking in smaller increments rather than larger. And that will help keep motivation high too.
Yeah. It's interesting to talk about, because I did an exercise with the team that I'm working with, in fact, just earlier this week. And it was just to have a conversation. I wasn't trying to make any we're going to have some grand decision as an output from this. It was just to have a conversation. And really, the three questions that I asked were, if you look at what was the old normal, what are three things that you'd love to actually, bring from that? What would be from the current normal, right? What are the three things you'd like to take from that to bring, and then for the future, what do you want to make sure that we bring into the future? And it was actually really interesting to actually listen to it, because one of the things that struck me was that what they were saying was that in the current normal, for want of a better term, they very intentionally spent more time dealing with kind of personal issues with people, right? So really inquiring about them, how they were, what was going on, and really made a really serious attempt, much more intentional than previously. And they said that, the results they were getting from that and the response they were getting from that, they said, we should not lose that whenever we get back into whatever we're going to do. But let's, for God's sake, make sure that we take that with us, because the upside of that, which is kind of, you say, is an obvious thing to do, but we don't always do the obvious things. But the upside of doing it was so powerful that it was just worth bringing into it. So I think there are great learnings from that. Can I just switch to your 6 zone performance indicators? We're probably not going to go through all of them, but
sure.
The first one that you have is being pivot ready, right? You hear the word pivot being talked about an awful lot, but and it's kind of easy to say it. Yeah. But how do you actually do it? I mean, how do you actually get your company pivot ready?
Well, you're right. It's a massive concept, right? It's just, we've fancified the word of change. So I would say the way, so we talk about it in a variety of ways, the Ready Zone, but I want to give you one small slice, because I think anyone can do it. And I call it like a back of the napkin exercise that you can do too, meaning that, and I'll give you a great example. So we talk a lot about what I call pivot moments, because I think if we think of things as moments, it's much more digestible.
Mm-hmm.
Because I could be great right now. I can't tell you about 10 minutes from now, but right now I can be great. So what we talk about is this formula that I affectionately call it like my P3 formula, which is perception, which is your emotions, plus your position, which is your experience about the changes, plus your performance, meaning your actions, create these pivot moments. And what I mean is that it's literally a mathematical equation. It's a diagnostic for you to see how you're doing. And let me give you this example. And it's a very innocuous example. So I had a conversation with a client of mine the other day, and it was the beginning. We were just starting to do some coaching together, and she's a senior vice president in finance and over a large portfolio. And one of her intentions for the coaching and for her growth, that while she was incredibly direct and in your face, oddly enough, there were lots of issues she sidestepped, and she lacked compassion, which is exactly the antithesis of what you and I are talking about. And she didn't know how to meld compassion with handling prickly issues, so her intention was to be compassionate and collaborative while being direct. So at the end of our conversation, we did something very Los Angeles, very Hollywood, which, we were setting up a meeting with her boss, and I said, my assistant will call your assistant, we'll schedule time and all that. And she said, oh no, please do everything through me. And I thought that was really odd because, she's managing 60 or so people. She's got an assistant. She wants to rise to an EVP level. I thought it was really weird, like scheduling, come on. So she said, no, because I don't trust my assistant. She's just not right for the job. So I was like, oh, wait, we gotta pause here for a moment. So we started diving into what her emotions were about her assistant. And she said that she was really angry, and she's really been frustrated, and she's really been disappointed, and oddly enough, afraid, which I thought was really interesting. And when we talked about what her experience is about her assistant, which means when she would see her every day, what would be her experience of her? And she said, well, I think she's doing a terrible job. I don't think she has the aptitude to get the job done. She doesn't have the desire to grow. And she's not doing the work that I give her, even though she's had deadlines, and those deadlines were followed up with. So I said, okay, well, let's just be candid. What actions are you taking with your assistant to support her intention of dealing with prickly issues with compassion and collaboration? So she said, and she started laughing, and I was like, okay. She said, well, I'm talking to my husband a lot about it.
Yeah, that'll solve it. Yeah.
Yeah. So she said, well, frankly, I'm complaining. And I said, okay, well, what are you, other than complaining, because that's great, and talking to your husband, also fabulous, what else are you doing? She said, I haven't really been doing much about it. When I asked her how long it was going on for, how long do you think, you deal in the realm of leadership, how long do you think this had been going on for?
By the sound of it, probably quite a while.
Yeah, 2 years.
I was actually going to say 6 months.
No, 2 years.
Wow.
So what was interesting is she never did much about it. She simply tolerated the behavior until it was intolerable. The pain of it being intolerable became a place to pivot. And don't you find that until we are in a place of pain, then we will move? But when we talk about pivoting, what does that really mean? Was she examining where she wasn't effective? Was she admitting her part? Were there opportunities for her to pivot earlier? Did she have to wait until she got to a place of intolerance for her to pivot? So really, when it comes down to it, when you're looking at what you can do, an effective leader looks at themselves first. Where can I take responsibility for where I can be in the cause and the matter to make adjustments? Mm-hmm. And so that is something we can all do regardless of title or position, that you can, because then you can say, what do I need to start doing and what do I need to stop doing? So that's why I say these pivot moments as a diagnostic. What are my emotions? What's my experience? What actions am I taking? And be just really honest with you, and then be able to say, okay, now what do I need to stop and start doing in order to create a different outcome? If we just did that, you'd see change happening all over the place.
Okay. And Esther, can I talk about one other one? You talk about impact ready. And, you know, and again, that's something they say, okay, we organizations need to be impact ready. But again, it's one of those things that's easy to say, but not necessarily easy to do. How do you, as a leader, how do you prepare your team to be impact ready?
There's one foundational thing that gets missed all the flipping time when it comes to teams. It makes me absolutely nuts. So, and I'll give you a great example. So last year I was working with a team from Sony, and the leader said to me, you know, my leadership team is a great core group, but I know that there is another level that we can go to as an organization of creativity and innovation. And so I said to her, well, where's your, what is the team committed to? What have you all agreed to that you're committed to achieving as it relates to the bigger vision of the organization? And so she started rattling things off. Oh, we're committed to creativity. We're committed to excellence. I said, okay, but that's nice. But are you? And is everybody agreed to that? So I'm a big believer in creating what I call a team commitment. It's not necessarily, it's, you know, some people may call it a vision. I actually call it a commitment. It's what the team agrees that they are committed to doing in order to achieve the organizational vision. Now, once a team creates that, there's a couple of things that need to happen in order for it to be seriously a tool that's powerful. Number one, once you create your commitment, then you have to say, okay, how are we agreeing now to work together in order to achieve that? Because maybe we're not collaborating, maybe we're not communicating. How are we decision making together? And also on teams, there are different roles that you take on that's different than my exact job title. And what was fascinating was a couple of months ago, she said to me, the team leader says to me, you know, I think we're off on our commitment. She said, because it's one thing to say what we're committed to, but it's another thing to actually perform it. And what I find is that people are gossiping, people are going behind each other's backs, they're sidestepping each other, they're circumnavigating, they're taking much longer to get the work done, and there's an efficiency that's really starting to be amiss. So we talked about it. I said to her, why don't you just put it up in people's face and say, we said this, how are we demonstrating it and not? And so she did it, and the conversation was incredibly powerful. And so they reoriented and recalibrated. And as a result, she actually moved one of her direct reports into a different role. And then as a result, the organization has become much more stealth, because their portfolio is millions of dollars to deliver on, their service organization, and they were being stymied. And especially in COVID, they were able to do it, luckily, 30 days before COVID. And once they went into quarantine, she said to me, what was so amazing is once we went into quarantine, I was shocked at how we didn't miss a beat when teams around us were flailing.
That's fantastic. Just we're talking about, before we wrap up, the virtual world, right? How do you see that playing out in the future? There's lots of speculation, but what's your view of what that virtual world will look like, or how people work in that virtual world?
Well, it's an interesting thing, because what people are not talking about yet is, because I think we're still in this virtual world, is how is AI going to impact us as well? And how is automation going to impact us? And I think that there's this going to be merging between working with the human element and the technology element that we're just starting to see signs of, which is still in its infancy. And we will need the human element dramatically. But I think that virtual workplaces are not going away. And I think that the talent war now is on, because now that you don't have to have people in your market, in your workplace to do work, clients of mine are leasing workplaces out now. So now the war for talent is truly global. Before you said it, and as you know,
but it wasn't really.
That's right. Yeah. Now I really think what you're going to start seeing is a war for talent, and what's going to be interesting to see too is not only the competition, but also how we're going to pay people. How are we going to compensate people? Because there's, in the tech world, they started this revolution like at Netflix, where if you're the best at what you do, we pay you top dollar. That's bottom line about it. But I wonder now if it's what I see now as being, well, if people could be anywhere and they're working from home, what does that top dollar look like? How are we? I think our compensation models are going to change. I think the war of talent's going to heat up. It'll be really interesting of how we see automation happening in the near future, because I think because what you are going to see is there's going to be a higher indexing really in the short term now on technology, even personally, to help us be more efficient. Personal assistants, virtual assistants, automated assistants. I mean, more Siri-esque, shall we say, even though she needs help. But, Siri-esque technology that helps us really move forward in the workplace. So I think you're going to see this melding in the future that's going to be really powerful. But we're not going to see people going back to work like they used to. Those days are over.
I mean, it's certainly, I mean, it's a well-hackneyed phrase, but I think it's true that COVID is an accelerator.
Absolutely.
On lots of different levels. Esther, this has been fascinating. We could go on, but I want to respect your time. Before we wrap up, 2 questions to ask everybody. One, a book other than your own that has had an impact upon you, which one it is and what impact it had.
I remember, and this was going back a few years ago, I read Ram Charan's book called Execution. And that really changed everything for me, because I thought that his perspective about how to actually get things done in a very practical, pragmatic way that melded strategy and people, I thought was really, really powerful. And I'll just throw one more in if I can, is Susan David's work around her book of emotional agility. I heard her speak at Harvard's coaching conference a few years ago, and it was like Moses parted the Red Seas for me, because someone was actually speaking about what you and I have been speaking to today with science behind it as a real business imperative. And so those are
what's the second one?
Emotional Agility by Susan David.
I haven't come across that before.
Oh, you have to read that book, and you have to read so Ram Charan's book, Execution, and Susan David's book, Emotional Agility, and also watch her TED Talk. She has an incredible TED Talk as well. And I think you out of all people, I think will love it. I think your audience would love it too. Yeah.
Add to the list. Add to the pile of books that is kind of growing there that I have to get around to read and find some time to do that. Second question is daily rituals, if you have them, what they are and what they do for you.
Okay, so I have a few. So my daily rituals is I exercise and I meditate. I will say I was not a meditator up until a few years ago. And then there's 4 questions that I answer for myself on a daily basis. One, and I do my best to do it in the morning and in the evening. Number 1, what am I grateful for? Number 2, what am I learning today? Number 3, who am I being in the face of today? And number 4 is, what am I committed to today? And so I try to answer all those 4 questions, both in the morning and the evening, to keep myself sharp and grateful.
Good. Yeah. Actually, it's curious. You got questions. I have 3 questions that I ask myself every day.
And what are those?
The first one is what to let go of.
Oh, I love that. Okay.
Right? You're grateful for, and what am I focused on? They're the 3. So
Those are great.
I love you. I love your 4 too. Esther, this has been a real joy. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll have everything in the show notes, but people listening, how can they get in touch with you?
Please go to thereadizone.com. And they can also download the book that you had mentioned, Why Your Company's Bottom Line is Not Your Top Priority, 6 Eye-Opening Strategies to Put People First. You can download the book there as well.
Thank you so much. You're very generous. Esther, thank you so much. And it has been fantastic. And we'd love to have you back.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it.